Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. In the grand spirit of continued counter-programming to the news of the week or the month, or in this case, maybe the century, I'm delighted to have Phil Muñoz on here. He's a professor of political science at Notre Dame. I've met him quite a few times. He had me out to speak at Notre Dame a while ago. And he knows all the things I'm interested in these days. He's also the author of a fantastic essay in the current, I believe it's still current, issue of National Affairs called The American Revolutions of 1776, which covers a lot of the America at 250 territory that we at the Dispatch are spending so much time on. And because the guys at UT will activate his pain collar if I don't say this, he wrote it while he was the distinguished visiting professor at the School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas, Austin. And this essay was, in fact, written for the collection that AEI did about America at 250. So it's really grotesque intellectual incestuousness all the way down. Phil, welcome to the Remnant.
Thank you for having me.
So normally I ask this about books, but I think it's sort of worth it because we're not going to just talk about your essay, but it's a good place to start. What's your essay about?
Yeah, well, let me just start by saying I'm a big fan of yours and the show, and I'm really pleased to be invited, finally, to be on it.
That's my failing. Actually, listeners should know we had a late start here. There's some technical issues. My intern, Rocco, yes, it's not his birth name, but it's his it's what he goes by. Is also a student and has done work for Phil at Notre Dame, and we agreed that there was no point in pointing fingers at each other about who messed up what or what technician did what. We just agreed to blame Rocco. So
definitely Rocco's fault. The fault being that I failed to log in properly. Which, if Rocco,
so I think it's also his fault that even though it's actually to his credit that he pushed me to have you on, but we should blame him also because I asked you if you would do this podcast like 3 years ago and then never followed up. But again, we'll blame Rocco even though he was in high school at the time.
Yeah, probably. All right. Well, the article. So I just tried to spell out in a relatively simple and straightforward way what I call the three revolutions of 1776. Those revolutions being a revolution in the grounds of political authority, that legitimate political authority arises by consent of the governed. That itself is tied to the fundamental starting point that all men are created equal. So equality and consent as the grounds of political authority. The second revolution, that the purposes of government are to secure the natural rights people have by nature. Rights do not come from government, but from they're endowed by our Creator. And then the third, and maybe this is the most novel part of the article, that not only the purposes of government to secure rights, the purposes of government are limited. That is, the role of government is not to secure salvation for us. What's new here, as I try to explain, which I think is consistent with what the founders thought, we limit the role of government out of respect for proper religious authority. There's a distinction between state authority and religious authority, and the state limits itself in due regard for religious authority. Religious authority itself having the obligation, the charge to help men achieve their salvation.
So one of the reasons I like this is I recently wrote a piece to launch our series at the Dispatch about why the American Revolution doesn't get the respect it deserves as the beginning of the revolutionary tradition. And I hate to say it because I'm mostly a fan of Hannah Arendt, but I think she's partly to blame. I'm also fine with throwing the Jacobins under the bus because I think they're partly to blame, and so are the Bolsheviks. But we can get to all of that. How do you see it? Like, Do you see the American Revolution as the first, like, if you're going to do the begats, as they say in the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you start with the Magna Carta? Do you start with the Glorious Revolution? Was the American Revolution sufficiently different in scale and character that it's also different in kind from the Glorious Revolution? How do you fit the three American Revolutions, or the one, however you want to phrase it, in the chronology and in the sort of revolutionary tradition as you define it?
Well, if you really, want to go all the way down on the begats, I think the fundamental revolution, which the American Revolution in a way is the culmination of, or a possible culmination of, is the fundamental revolution is in the Gospels, right? When Jesus says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God's what is God's," I think. I don't know. I'm Catholic. If you're a Christian, you hear this all the time. Sort of becomes ordinary. We lose sight on how revolutionary that saying was, that response was, because it implies at least two things. First, that political authority is legitimate. Give to Caesar what is Caesar. Caesar has something. We owe Caesar something. Jesus is not an anarchist. He's not anti-government. But he also says, give to God's what is God's, implying that what is God's is not Caesar's. And Caesar's own self-understanding of the time is he rules by divine right, which is the common and ordinary understanding in history. Right. And so, look, I'm not a biblical scholar. I probably have theologians all over the place jumping up and down mad right now. But it seems a straightforward reading of that passage is saying, Jesus is saying, the foundations of a political authority are not divine right. That there's a distinction between religious authority and political authority. That itself is revolutionary. And figuring out, well, what if there are two authorities? How are they related? Right? You could say that's both. That tension is becomes the fundamental question in Western political thought after the Gospels. Explodes with the Protestant Reformation. And the founders provide maybe not the only answer to that question, but perhaps the politically best answer to that question. And not only theoretically, then they did it. They legislated it. So it's a problem or an issue that starts from the Gospels. And the founders have offered, it's what seems to me at least to be the most workable solution.
Let me come in a. I generally agree with you. I just had a great conversation with this guy Tomer Persico, who wrote this book In God's Image, where we got into a lot of this. I will say that that idea, which you then get in St. Augustine with the city God and city of man and all that. I think I agree with you that that's all very powerful. It also kind of goes quiescent for a couple thousand years in the sense. I mean, there was rhetorical and scholarly and theological attention paid to it, but the rule of divine right of kings kind of pushed back on that idea a bit. But I will say that I also think that the fact that the Roman Empire split and basically the Eastern Roman Empire, which considered itself the Roman Empire, continued for another 1,000 years or whatever, while the religious capital of the empire, the Vatican, Rome, stayed where it was, right? I mean, so it wasn't Caesaropopism where you have the head of the church and the head of the state in one body in one physical location. That separateness, I think, is one of the things that is sort of, I mean, this stuff better than I do, but Magna Carta by itself is not a particularly flowery, interesting, high-minded document. It's a pretty grubby compromise, trade deal kind of thing. But the fact that it was written down and that it proved that the king had to be answerable, creating that civil society space between different forms of secular authority, I think that process kind of begins building on the idea of give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and under me, and to God what is God's. But like literally the space between the two authorities in the East and West creates the sort of ground conditions that make a lot of that stuff possible.
Yeah, I think history is complex and goes in all sorts of different directions. What the gospel passage does is maybe it creates a separation,
right?
And that separation in practice, even if they're unified in one particular person, or there's two authorities that cooperate very intimately, or but still a separation in principle. And then, given historical circumstances, that the space, it's a nice way to put it, the space can open up. And what the founders, now this is after the Protestant Reformation, what the founders provide is a harmonious relationship between the two. And the key to that harmonious relationship, at least according to my argument, is really a subordination of the state. It's keeping religion in its proper sphere, namely that religious authorities do not get to use the sword,
mm-hmm.
and keeping the state in its proper sphere, meaning the state does not try to achieve salvation using the sword. That's what the founders worked out, and the opportunity to work that out is dependent on all sorts of historical circumstances, as you're alluding to, mm-hmm. complicated and messy. But in that situation, what's sort of amazing is that they, these men are statesmen. They're practical men. They're not, they're not political theorists. They're not tenured professors writing books. They're practical men who actually, George Washington quite literally led a revolution. They're soldiers. They're fighters. And then they're legislators. There's political men. What's amazing is that these active political men, soldiers and legislators, could also articulate principles of justice, write the Federalist Papers, make an argument about political justice. It's really a merging of political power and philosophical insight. And that's so unique.
Yeah, so I mean, let's talk about that for a second, because if you consider the American Revolution sort of the beginning of for want of a better term, certainly the American Enlightenment, but like of the Enlightenment, in general. When I say the beginning of the Enlightenment, I don't necessarily mean the beginning of the arguments for the Enlightenment, right? And in some ways, the American Revolution is the culmination of a lot of those arguments. But where the Marxists would call praxis, right, where the rubber meets the road, where stuff actually starts to happen, it's the American Revolution that gets things going. And then the French Revolution comes not long after, and seems maybe not. I don't think it's fair to say at the beginning. At the beginning, I think the French Revolution was pretty deeply influenced by the American Revolution, but it goes wildly off the rails pretty badly, pretty quickly. And this is sort of where Irving Kristol makes his argument about how the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution and many subsequent revolutions is that it was a successful revolution, which is one of the things the left could never forgive, because there's nothing like the martyrdom of a failed revolution. And then Irving's argument is that the reason why it succeeds is it takes human nature into account, while the subsequent revolutions didn't. I assume you largely, or you at least somewhat subscribe to all of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'll say one other thing that's, I think, fully compatible with what you presented correctly as Irving Kristol's view, which I agree with, is not only does the American Revolution take human nature into account, or a proper understanding of human nature, but also natural limits. I think the key to understanding the American Revolution, and here would be a key difference with the French Revolution. Let me just focus on the American Revolution, though. The American founders American revolutionaries clearly understood natural rights to be part of the natural law, and therefore bounded by the natural law. Mm-hmm. That is, and that limits the authority of the people themselves, right? That there's a moral law that governs right and wrong, and that's above the people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we think of the Declaration of Independence. We say, look, the King of England is governing us tyrannically. We are judging the king based on a standard of nature and nature's God, a natural law standard, right? And based on that standard, he's being tyrannical, and we are right in overthrowing him. But when we institute new government, we too are subject to the same standard.
Mm-hmm.
That is, the people themselves can't do anything. Jefferson says in his first inaugural, I believe, the people ought to govern, but they can only do rightfully what is reasonable. This is also the same issue of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, just to propel us forward, right? The issue between Lincoln and Douglas is, Douglas says, well, how should we deal with Stephen Douglas, not Frederick Douglass. Stephen Douglas says, look, we're divided about slavery. We're divided whether that the black man is equal. Should he be free or not? And Stephen Douglas says, well, let the people decide. The people can decide whether the slave is a man or not. He's the first pro-choice politician. I mean, this is the essence of the French Revolution. The people decide everything.
Right.
And Lincoln says, no, the people can't decide. The people have no legitimate authority to decide who is and who is not a man. The people, too, are subject to the natural moral law. And a people who says this group of people are not people is tyrannical. So that strain of a moral law limiting the people, the natural law limiting natural rights or bounding natural rights, was there at the beginning in the American Revolution. And I think this is not only why it was successful, but why it didn't spin out of control, as you'd say.
So moving up, we're going to circle back to some of this, but as you note in the essay, there are people who are just sort of souring on American liberalism or American founding principles. And actually, before I get to the thing I want to read from your essay, is it right to call the founders didn't use the word liberal? Dan Klein has got this great piece out where he finally figures out the origin of, he finally connects the dots about where we get the term liberal as a political label. And it actually, what I always was told or always thought, actually doesn't come from the Spanish liberals of Cadiz. It actually comes from Adam Smith. But that's neither here nor there. Is it right to call them classical liberals? Is there a term that because the term liberal has become so muddied, to my great frustration, that it's very difficult. It's just confusing to a lot of normie people to say, the founding fathers were liberals, but they kind of obviously were if we have a certain definition of what it meant to be a liberal at that time. What just in terms of nomenclature, how do you deal with this, like with your classes?
No. It's I think the founders space, as the kids say today, the space the founders occupy in our language would be sort of classical liberalism,
right?
But it's not a term they use. I mean, they call themselves Republicans. Now, there's a Republican tradition, a classical Republicanism that you could say goes back to Aristotle, that isn't quite right. So even the term Republican, the leading alternative, has problems. So you can call them modern Republicans. The term I use, which is consistent with their uses, they're natural rights Republicans. Mm-hmm. Republican connotates government by the people. Natural rights communicates the aim of government is to protect natural rights and is limited to protecting natural rights. So natural rights Republican or natural rights Republicanism connects to those three revolutions I started off by talking about in the article. Mm-hmm. So I like using the term they're natural rights Republicans. It's consistent with their own self-usage and it communicates, I think, their position. But of course, what Republican, that itself has they're not
Well,
Republican.
you're anticipating my follow-up question,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
go on.
Well, I mean, we have a Republican Party, and
Yeah.
so there can be that confusion. And then classical republicanism, which is often understood in a sort of line between from Aristotle to Rousseau, that's different from natural rights republicanism. So none of the terms are perfect.
Yeah, I mean, like, I've talked about this a bunch on here. I've written about it a bunch. I have constantly evolving views on this point, but I'm kind of curious what yours are. When you hear someone say, well, it doesn't have to be Mike Lee, but someone like Mike Lee say, this is not a democracy, it's a republic. What do you hear in that? What are the conclusions I'm supposed to draw from that? What does that mean? In terms of practical terms, because it's true. The word democracy, I don't think appears anywhere in the Constitution. There's not a lot about elections in the Constitution. I am not a election voluptuary. I think they're really essential for the things they're essential at, and little more. But what does it mean to say this is not a democracy, this is a republic?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what I think, and this is
okay.
And your listeners will be like, well, he's really somewhat odd. What I think is Aristotle's 6 types of regimes.
Oh, you're one of those guys.
Yeah. I mean, Aristotle says, look, there's rule by the one, rule by the few, rule by the many. Mm-hmm. And there's good forms and bad forms. So there's 6 types of regimes. Rule by the one that's bad is tyranny, right? Rule by the one that's good is monarchy. Rule by the few that's bad is oligarchy. Rule by the few that's good is aristocracy. Rule by the many that's bad, he says, is democracy. Because they rule in their own interest. They don't rule for the common good. Aristotle says, rule by the many for the common good, Aristotle says, is a regime that has no name because it never happens. Mm-hmm. That's what the founders are trying to do. So
I like that.
The problem with democracy is it leads too easily to the idea that majority rule, whatever the majority says is right. Mm-hmm. Might makes right. The majority are the many. Might makes right. That's Stephen Douglas's position, just to tie it into what we were just talking about.
Right.
That's not right. And the founders were very clear. So we have all these checks on the majority, right? The Senate itself is a mm-hmm. check. Why do we have a House and a Senate? Why not just a House or an even larger House? And the purpose of the Senate, now whether it fulfills this purpose today, we could talk about, but the purpose of the Senate, or why we have a Senate, why we have separation of powers, Publius says, the founders say, is to help distinguish the reason of the public from the passions of the public. Yes, the public should govern, but what we want is the reason of the public, not the passions of the public. So when people say we're not a democracy, what I hear is we're supposed to have the reason of the public, not the will, not simply the will or the passions of the public governed. And we have all sorts of counter-majoritarian checks to filter passion out of politics as much as possible.
Yeah, and there's also, we can come back to that, but there's also the problem with saying that they call themselves Republicans, is that it gets complicated. In France, to call yourself a Republican meant you were crazy ass radical, right?
Yeah.
But like for most places, certainly by the revolutions of 1848 and all that kind of stuff, again, outside of France, because that's a different tradition and they co-opted that word. But when you talked about being a Republican, it kind of meant a liberal, right? It didn't necessarily mean you were a Democrat, small d, but it meant you wanted the people to have more representation. You wanted the maybe at least bourgeois, the middle classes to have more say. You wanted the rule of law. You wanted fair courts. You wanted maybe constitutional monarchy, not get rid of the monarchy, but like it was always the thing. Republicanism, forget the natural rights part for 2 seconds. Just republicanism and liberalism were really, as a practical political matter, maybe not a philosophical matter, kind of interchangeable words and concepts for a lot of political movements, and so it gets even more difficult. And I think philosophically, liberalism and republicanism are different things, to be sure. I mean, they share some things in common, but they're different things. But it gets difficult. Like if you read what republicanism meant to the founders in practical terms, it sounds a lot like what liberalism stood for in the late 18th century as well, because there were very few sort of wild-eyed small d Democrats anywhere, right? So it was always about sort of countering, sort of the Polybian, I assume that's how you say it, for Polybius, the mixed regime stuff of Montesquieu. It was not, like, let's just have plebiscitary democracy for everybody, but all the different flavors of liberalism and republicanism were all about checking the arbitrary power of kings. And so as a political term, at the time, it's very hard for. The reason why I'm dwelling on this is I'm reading up on all this stuff now, and it's very hard to tease out the distinctions between these things when you're reading when in the context at the time.
You said let's leave aside natural rights for the moment. I understand why you say that, but in a way,
it back in.
keeping the natural rights part in a way is essential because it gives direction. The natural rights give the direction. Whether you say you're liberal or Republican, both have connotations of the people governing, to a large extent. What's the end to which they're governing, and that's what the natural rights helps provide. It both sets the orientation or direction, that is the purpose of the political community is to secure natural rights, and also the limits. I mean, this is how do you limit authority, whether it's the many or the few. What are the limits of political authority? What are the things that would be illegitimate for the people to try to do? And the natural rights provides that basis.
Yeah, but you could. I apologize for belaboring this, but if I say I'm a natural rights liberal, and you say you're a natural rights Republican, and we're both, what do we disagree on?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you tell me what comes to your mind, because I mean, people don't really say they're not. My goal is more to get people to reintroduce the term natural rights more than anything.
I get it. But my point is that, like, if I say I'm a classical liberal, for a lot of people, certainly our libertarian friends, and neither of us are strictly speaking libertarian, but we like to have fun on Saturday night. We hang out with them sometimes. And if I say I'm a classical liberal, for most sort of up to speed ears, that means I'm a believer in something like natural rights, doesn't it?
I think so. Practical purpose. I mean, maybe when you push it, and I'm not sure. The universe of people we're talking about who make
it's
these
very small. I agree. I apologize.
Pretty small. So
this podcast is called The Remnant for a reason.
That where push comes to shove, though, for these 8 people who have it debate is what is the grounds of freedom, right? And the natural rights connects it to nature. What I connect it to human nature, right? Sometimes, especially with my libertarian friends, their understand. I don't know what grounds their understanding of freedom. They don't really have a what's freedom for, or if you really push it, it becomes to satisfy desires or the passions. Yeah. And I think that might, so you could be a classical liberal who think, well, it's just the aim is the satisfaction of desires. I think, and I think that's true for many libertarians, and they might have an elevated conception of desire. So I don't mean to belittle them, but really, there's no hierarchy of desires,
right?
And I think that's where certainly the founders did not think that, and I think that's where the natural rights emphasizes that, because natural rights why do you have natural rights? Because of human nature, and that's in the hierarchy to go in the classical foundation, the hierarchy of the soul. That reason is to govern passions. So one other theme, if I can just go on this, that comes in the essay where we started off is what are the virtues the founders are trying to cultivate? Yeah, lots of my conservative friends who criticize the founding say, it's all freedom. There's no virtue.
Mm-hmm.
What are the virtues? I mean, the real virtue of the founding of natural rights republicanism, or even just say liberal democracy, is the cultivation of the virtue of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And that suggests there is a proper way of living. But you yourself as an individual, as a father or mother, as a member of a community, as a religious person, you are responsible for elevating yourself first and foremost. And so this is all compatible with the idea of subsidiarity,
Mm-hmm.
parents having authority of their children. So when we talk about political freedom, why are we aiming to make people free? So they can be responsible for themselves, not so they can indulge their passions. So that's what human flourishing is,
Mm-hmm.
right? And ultimately, what are the grounds of responsibility? They are the ability of human beings to know the moral law and to choose to live accordingly. And so that's where the difference from libertarians would lie.
Okay, that's helpful. Now I want to read the second paragraph from your essay. You describe the arguments at the founding, and then at the Declaration, and then you say, while most, if not all, of these arguments have been addressed, a different criticism has emerged in recent years from the quote-unquote post-liberal right. Liberalism has failed, political theorist Patrick Deneen alleges, because liberalism has succeeded. On natural rights, the late philosopher Alistair MacIntyre wrote, quote, "The truth is plain. There are no such rights, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and in unicorns," unquote. The political philosophy of the American founding, some on the right now claim, was untrue, and it has eroded traditional morality and undermined sound religious belief. So the first question I have is, because I wrestle with this on this podcast all the time, is how seriously I like Patrick Deneen personally. I know he's a colleague of yours, and I think he's a smart guy. I think he's profoundly in error in many things. But the question is, first of all, just how seriously should we take the post-liberal right? Is it a 10 on the scale of threats, or is it a 0 or a 1 or somewhere in the middle to the vision of the founding and the broader rights commitment to that vision?
Yeah. Well, Patrick is a friend. I hired him here at Notre Dame, and he's a tremendous thinker and a beautiful writer. So
we don't have to make this about Patrick. I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
No. I say this in part. I profoundly disagree with him in his understanding of America. But personally, I just like interesting and thoughtful people, which he certainly is. And I will say his own writing and has helped me think. Pressed me to think through things more clearly. So, in a way, I'm deeply appreciative, and the disagreement leads to hopefully more insight.
For sure.
Well, your question was, how seriously should we take it? I will say, maybe this is abating a bit now, but a few years ago, all the young people I was teaching, mostly on the right, but on the left too, this is what they were thinking about. It was shocking, like all out of nowhere. I mean, Patrick's book had a tremendous influence, and Adrian Vermeule, his writing, also his Twitter account, a tremendous influence on young people. They struck a chord, and that their fundamental insight is something's wrong with our society, and they provided an answer that captivated the attention of lots and lots of young people. I think. Your question is, how seriously should we take it? I mean, just the fact that it attracted so many captivated the attention of so many young people, that itself should be taken seriously. Their argument should be taken seriously.
I mean, I have an answer to that, but I a response at least. But the fact that you said, which is something I've heard from other people, a couple of years ago, that's what you were hearing from your students.
Yeah.
Not to get all Straussian in my interpretation of the significant silences here, but it suggests that that's no longer the case today.
So two things I think happened, and maybe the biggest thing is Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey were overturned. I think if Roe is not overturned in the Dobbs decision, this is 2022, right? If Roe is not overturned, my personal belief is the Federalist Society, the conservative legal movement, would have been absolutely destroyed. And the only thing remaining would have been the post-liberals. And let me explain that for a little bit.
Sure.
If Roe is not overturned, abortion, the American regime is a pro-abortion regime. It will never be overturned if Roe wasn't overturned, right? Let me go back to Lincoln. Lincoln was criticized at the time by people like Frederick Douglass for not being strenuously sufficiently against slavery. And Lincoln said, look, we can tolerate slavery as much as we hate it. He said it was a monstrous evil. We can tolerate it as long as we believe it's on the course of ultimate extinction. And I think he took many actions to put it on the course, maybe even to bring about the conditions that would put it on the course of ultimate extinction. But he said, I will tolerate a great evil to avoid a greater one. But it was fundamental in Lincoln's own psychology that America had to believe that slavery was wrong and it was on the course of ultimate extinction. Same with abortion for many conservatives. We can tolerate this great evil if we believe there's a way to remedy it. If Roe is not overturned, I think many people would have concluded America as a project committed to natural rights is over. That's how deep I think the crisis would have been. And the post-liberals would have been the only intellectual group left standing. And
I don't want to. We have listeners that cross a lot of ideological spectrum. We're not here to debate about abortion. You're making an analytical point about, let's just say, the intellectual right writ large to a certain extent, and the religious right has too many connotations. The socially conservative movement, and I think you're largely right about as an analytical point. Isn't there an inherent irony here that again, maybe not Patrick Deneen, but the broader post-liberal right, as your quote from McIntyre suggests, doesn't actually believe in natural rights. And so you're saying that the undermining of that this large group of people who believe in natural rights would lose faith in the faction of the right that believes in natural rights and join up with the faction that doesn't. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying that's weird.
It's deeply ironic. Yeah, I mean, this group who post-liberals, my criticism is you don't understand the resources within the American liberal or American natural rights tradition. And this is a mistake. I mean, the way you interpret America and the American founding would suggest that there is a right to abortion, right? And you're wrong. So you're wrong in your understanding. You're wrong philosophically. You're wrong historically, and you're wrong politically. But people disagree. I mean, I think their intellectual arguments are genuine. I just think they're wrong about America. And I thought it was unhelpful politically to boot. So you have the overturning of Dobbs, and then you have the Trump's victory. And I think that, if Trump doesn't win in 2024, I think of where the culture is on transgenderism. It's so, it was storming in, and then all of a sudden it stopped. And, we'll see where we are in 2028 or 2029. But I think Dobbs, Trump, took a lot of the steam out of the post-liberals.
No, but that's definitely my impression. And I've talked to people from the Federalist Society world who basically think Dobbs dealt a death blow to a lot of the common good constitutionalism, which is just basically the legal wing of this post-liberal stuff. I will just say one of the things that really equipped me well for arguing about the post-liberal right is that I've been having arguments for 25 years with the post-liberal left.
Yeah.
And it turns out that once you're illiberal,
Yeah.
the distinctions between, I mean, you're basically, it's like, it's in the crazy quantum physics stuff. They started giving flavors to these different particles because that was the only way to distinguish them. And one has a half spin and another one has a quarter spin, and one's facing upward, one's facing downward, and all that kind of stuff. The distinctions between various forms of illiberalism at sort of the quantum level they're almost aesthetic as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with my priors, right, to the people writ large. If aesthetically, I find post-liberal right-wing stuff more attractive than post-liberal left-wing stuff, but I find them both deeply unattractive.
Yeah.
Right? But if you're going to give me the architecture of Mussolini over the architecture of Stalin, I will take Mussolini's architecture, it's that kind of thing. And
your example just captures something. They're both deeply statist, both sides.
for sure. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is illiberalism has to be almost definitionally statism because non-statist illiberalism is, except for some flavors of anarchism, isn't the thing, right? I mean, it's sort of like Aristotle's sixth form of government that has no name. Like non-statist illiberalism is I guess it's anarchy, right? I mean, like real anarchy, not Emma Goldman anarchy, like Somalia with warlords, where everybody treats you really crappily wherever you go, and it's sort of like Locke's state of nature, where strong men beat you up. But and so anyway, the reason I bring this up is I wrote a piece for Commentary almost 15 years ago about the popularity then of socialism with young people. Mm-hmm. And I did a pretty deep dive in the data on all that stuff and read a bunch of analyses and explanations for it. And it turns out that Americans, particularly young people who, I know you were a college professor, so you have to be a little more diplomatic about this, but as a statistical matter, young people know less than old people. And all other things being equal. And young people, when they don't like the status quo in America, if they think the status quo means capitalism, then they're for whatever is against the status quo. Yeah. And for a lot of young people, that meant socialism.
Yep.
And it's not like, I mean, the number of AOC or Zoran Mandami fans who have read more than 4 sentences of Marx or any of that, it's very small, right? Yeah. But they like the frisson, the rebelliousness of it. They like being sort of Byronic romantic heroes against the established order and all that BS. And then it turns out a really good job market makes a lot of that just sort of float away. Yeah. And I feel like a lot of the post-liberal right is analogous to that. I mean, again, Marx was the first modern post-liberal, and I think that, Patrick's last book, I thought it was way too cute, but all the sort of winking references to Lenin and Marx and, what is to be done and that kind of stuff, they're not coincidental.
Yeah,
it's because it's an argument over market share for the same sort of alienated young people, and it just turns out that some of those alienated young people are right of center culturally, but they want the same kind of statism. Anyway, if you think that's unfair, I'd love to know.
Yeah, well, just 2 thoughts. One, this has been hitting me recently. I'm in my early 50s. Ronald Reagan and Abraham Lincoln, in the views of college students today, are both just really old guys who are in the past. To me and my friends, socialism was not attractive because we grew up with East Germany.
Right.
No, we know it doesn't work. Like, we didn't have to read Hayek to know it doesn't work, or even Marx. Like, the Cold War, the combination of Jimmy Carter. Like, one of my first political memories is standing in a gas line with my mom.
Yeah.
To get gas, right? And seeing the impoverishment of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Like no one could believe socialism works or communism works. Like we knew it didn't. We saw it with our own eyes. But young people don't have that experience. No, that's just the past. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that's really different is, look, I graduated from college in 1993. I didn't use the internet. I didn't have a cell phone when I in college. I think I got a cell phone my last year in graduate school, which means I didn't have access to pornography growing up. And the experience of young people and what the internet, really what pornography has done to young people, if you talk to them, they hate it.
Yeah.
And they realize this is no good. Like the culture that we're born into, that we've been raised, is no good. And I think that is that explains a lot of the post-liberal, the openness to something else. You know, what you've passed down to us, we can't figure out how to get married. Our desires are warped. You're telling me I can be a woman if I want. Like this is their experience. You've also put me on Ritalin. Their experience is this is not good.
Yeah.
And when
I'm sympathetic to all that.
I'm very sympathetic. Yeah. And if that's freedom, I don't want it. Is how I think, and that makes you open to people saying, "Well, this is why you're miserable." And I that's really important that we see why these young people are unhappy, and they're unhappy. And I think Patrick and the others tapped into that, and they presented a story which explained the misery. And and they're right in seeing the misery.
No, I think that's right, and that's something where I wish, like, I wrote my first piece about how I wrote an article for National Review 20-something years ago, proposing something called a domain name called .kids, which would be a hardwired internet for minors that just literally you could not have access to for pornographers or anything like that. Severe criminal penalties for it, all that kind of stuff. Still think it's a great idea. There's been some progress on this, but it's clearly not enough. My problem is that there is nothing within, whether we want to call it natural rights republicanism, or classical liberalism, or old-fashioned conservatism, or constitutionalism, that says the country cannot ban. The technology is a different question, right? But like as a matter of law and constitutionality, there is nothing out there that says we cannot ban pornography for minors 100%. On the internet, right? 100%. And age gate it. And I'm sorry if that makes it burdensome for some businesses. So be it. So it's hard. It's more burdensome. But the fact is pornography. I mean, you said there was no pornography when you were a kid. There was plenty of pornography. It was just really hard for us to get. Right? I mean, you had to like go through the social stigma of going to a store that sold these things, and you were on a camera, and there was a guy behind a counter who was really creepy looking, and you had to ask for it, and you can get in huge trouble with your parents or your school if you stole. And like Playboy is so sweet and innocuous compared to the porn that's out there today. But if you stole your friend's dad's Playboy, you can get in huge trouble. And the reason why kids didn't have pornography is, one, because the technology made it harder, but the law was actually enforced better. Yeah. And so this idea that you need to sort of say, let's get rid of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights to fight porn. I was like, no, let's use the ideas of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights to not to ban porn for all humans or all people. I mean, I'm not a big pro-porn person. I just think it's obvious that kids should not have access to this depravity in their formative years. And that's something that I know a lot of left-of-center people who agree with that.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's really interesting teaching you say, well, where did we go wrong? And you read these Supreme Court decisions from the 60s. and I'll highlight Justice Brennan in particular. And this is when, the old standard, First Amendment standard, in 1957, a case called Roth v. United States, was the public, the people, usually in a local community, but the people could ban anything. Legitimate government could outlaw anything that, if the material fell into the hands of a child, it would deprave the child. So you could ban it, not just for access to children, for anyone, right? And ideally, this was enforced by local communities. So, a suburb in Indiana where I'm at can have a different standard than Indianapolis, and a different standard from Times Square. And, so there's local government is important in the execution of this. But the local community can control what's accessible to children by controlling what's accessible to everyone. That was the old standard as late as 1957. A series of Supreme Court decisions from the early 60s to the early 70s upends all of that. And it's all part of the sexual revolution. And when you teach those cases to kids today, they see the connection that what these guys were doing, what William Brennan was doing in the 60s, made it possible for the world we grow up on. And they say, the students today say, these guys were so foolish, so dumb, so clueless, so naive. The jurisprudence is laughable in the eyes of kids today. But that's where it was unleashed. I mean, these mistakes. Look, the pornography in 1968, when William Brennan is saying we need to loosen up these laws against pornography, is nothing. But the errors in philosophical understanding of rights and the powers of local communities would become magnified, within 2 generations. And so this is my response in a way to the post-liberals. No, the errors were not in the Declaration of Independence. The errors really, I don't want to, the 60s were terrible for constitutional government. Absolutely terrible. And across the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And a lot of the problems we're suffering with today are because of really poor jurisprudence back then, when the people want to say, no, we don't want this stuff in our community, right? They can't do it because of earlier Supreme Court decisions.
And we should hold open, just in the name of intellectual or epistemological humility, that your students may not be wholly representative of kids today.
100%.
Yeah.
But
just when you say kids today think this, I think youth politics is a garbage concept, in that generational politics are really problematic, even though Generation X is the best generation. I contain multitudes. But
obviously,
obviously.
And Rocco has no understanding of that, by the way, just to throw that. But
anyway,
Jonah, can I say
yeah.
I think almost all young people know. Let me just speak. Almost all young people know that porn is really bad for them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they might want access to it and all that. I mean, they're human. I mean, they're men are men, but they all kind of know it's bad. The older, you read these arguments from the 90s from both feminists and really conservatives too, to be honest, and they're like, the moderate use of porn is not so bad. Young people just don't believe that because of their own experience.
Yeah. No, and they're right.
They're right.
I mean, I think one of the signs of this is we're, not to date myself with song titles, but we're turning Japanese in a lot of ways. And for work, when I was a television producer, I visited Japan in the mid-90s, and the ubiquity of porn then in very early internet culture. It wasn't an internet phenomenon. It was that you would go to a electronics store, and next to DVDs of Freaky Friday, there are DVDs of essentially snuff film kind of stuff. And there were manga, comic book. There's a character named Rape Man. There's like a lot of creepy bad stuff, and there's a reason why, if you look at these surveys about Japanese young people, how so many of them have just lost interest in sex. because they've been in effect desensitized to it. Yuval Levin, our friend, he wrote this great piece a while back, which prompted me to write a column about how we're turning Japanese, where he pointed out that like there are all of these indicators that in the 1980s and 90s conservatives were lamenting: out of wedlock births, teen pregnancy, all these kinds of things that were going down. But you've all pointed out that the reason they were going down is that kids were becoming scared of engaging in life, right? They were kind of like losing their energy, and in all sorts of ways. And so teen pregnancy is going to go down, and out of wedlock births are going to go down when people just lose interest in sex.
Yeah.
As a correlated, statistical matter. And I think that's culturally, that's a big issue.
And birth rates are going down too, right? I mean, like the fact that young people, it's very common for young people just to not want to have kids.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that's a real cultural change. I mean, how does it happen? And it's not just a handful of people. Like think of Europe, but it's also in America, that when a people doesn't want to regenerate itself, these natural human drives, it's a culture of death. It's something's wrong.
I agree with that. So in the time we have left, though, I did want to get at this because part of your full title is you hold some fancy pants de Tocqueville chair or something or other, and you're kind of a de Tocqueville guy. And I was actually talking again. I mentioned Yuval Levin on here a lot, particularly when we're talking about this kind of stuff. Yuval had recently made the case to me. Like, all right, I'll back up. Take Yuval out of it. I bring up in here all the time that while I really am interested in intellectual history, and I like intellectual history, and I think ideas matter, and Richard Weaver was right when he said that ideas have consequences in his book called Ideas Have Consequences. I agree with all of that, right? And and I agree with you about the importance of Jesus saying, "Render unto Caesar," and that had this unfolding effect of creating a healthy tension in Western civilization that took a long time and it's still not done, of coming to culmination. I agree with all that. At the same time, as I kind of intimated about the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, sometimes ideas are lagging indicators rather than leading indicators, and that the ideas follow events on the ground and provide a atmosphere, a climate, a context for them, a permission structure. And I think the way you were talking about the desiccation of culture with porn is a good example of it, is that in your own telling, the post-liberals didn't create the argument. They from nothing, right? It wasn't some like, is it that facts on the ground were changing?
Yep.
And then they came up with this argument that framed it for people in a way that they could say aha about, right?
Yep.
And so I ask this basically every time the subjects of liberalism or republicanism come up on here. I always ask my people, because I struggle with this myself, and I'm trying to answer it to my own satisfaction. Is liberalism or natural rights republicanism, however we want to go, that the quan of these things, right? How much of it is driven by ideas, and how much of it is that the ideas are kind of like tracer elements, barium, right? This thing that lights up the progress on the ground. Like, is it Hayekian common law, where it's trial and error on the ground, and then people come up with best practices, and then they put a name on it, and they call that due process or liberalism or property rights or whatever? Are events driving things, or are ideas driving things, or it's both? And everyone eventually says both, but you get to answer it however you want to say it.
Well, I'm going to end up by saying both, but let me give a concrete example of where the facts come first. Facts on the ground come first, and then the ideas follow. In the history of republicanism, natural rights or otherwise, but the history of republicanism is that the republics must be small, and that's in Montesquieu, and no, Montesquieu's
Even Rousseau says his
Yeah.
social contract stuff doesn't work anything bigger than Geneva, right?
Yeah. So think of the argument of Federalist 10. It's for a large, extended republic with a multiplicity of interests. No Republican thinker really thought a multiplicity of interests was a good idea. Well, why not? Well, a republic is where the people governed. And if you don't want faction, the people basically have to agree, which means they have to be the same. They have to have the same interests, the same background, the same character. You have to be harmonious, and therefore you have to be homogenous. And Madison makes this argument, antecedents in Hume, that no, actually a large republic with a multiplicity of interests will protect a liberty better. You could say, well, that argument is of necessity. Why? Because look, he's making an argument for America. America is already really large. The 13 states or 13 colonies, 13 states, are already too big for a republic in the traditional understanding. You have the Protestant Reformation has happened. You're not going to have religious unity even among Protestants. There's too many sects of Protestants, and then you have a handful of Catholics and others, a handful of Jews in America already. Those facts allow Madison to think creatively. Mm-hmm. So here's where the facts are there. Can you still have Republican government with these new facts? And Madison, his genius is to say, yeah, actually, here's the way to do it. Another area, there's no noble class or aristocratic class in America, right? So the mixed regime traditionally is you got the peasants and the nobles, right? And you give each a share, and those classes are relatively fixed. Well, there's no hereditary aristocracy, landed aristocracy in America. That's a fact. And so you can't have the traditional mixed regime in America. You just don't have the material. And so these are facts. And well, we create a Senate, but it's not like the hereditary body. And so these are just concrete examples in our constitutional practice that the facts, in a way, were given. And it's not that the theory was created to meet the facts. The facts allowed for creative thinking about how do you maintain the separation of powers? Can religious diversity be good for political liberty? And the answer is yes, if you limit the aims of the state. It turns out Tocqueville helps us see, and that's good for religion too. So I think I'm getting to your question on new facts. New facts prevent avenues or opportunities for political prudence to govern.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about it is, we call it the Industrial Revolution, but it's not a political revolution, right? It's a revolution on the ground that creates enough middle class people that certain ideas become non-aristocratic middle class people, right? Who say, why are the aristocrats got all these rights and I don't when I'm paying all the taxes? And that creates opportunities for new argument or even old arguments to work now, right? I mean, when Ben Franklin says a republic, if you can keep it, it's not like there hadn't been republics before, just they hadn't worked before, and maybe this time they will. But
can I say new facts create the opportunity for really bad arguments too? I mean,
sure.
So you have the Industrial Revolution plus the Depression is sort of the necessary facts for FDR to say. Right. He says, in 1932, the era of creativity, of new production, of new, economic ideas is over. In 1932, He says this. This is the era of administration. We have to distribute resources. We're not going to create new resources. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. But the Industrial Revolution, which is a revolution in the economy, plus the Depression, made people think, oh, maybe this is right. Right. Yeah. And so he's giving a new theory to fit these new facts. I mean, I think.
There's also just the rise of. There's the rise of the social scientists and the disinterested, as Lippmann would put it, experts. And you're not going to get past me without me saying the real blame goes back to Woodrow Wilson, and FDR just picks it up. Right. But you mentioned de Tocqueville, which was the thing I wanted to get at about when I was frumfering talking about Yuval. When so Yuval taught us AEI honors course on liberalism. I think it's okay for me to talk out of school about this. It wasn't like I was interviewing, but I was asking about it. Like, what's the assigned reading? Who are the thinkers that are essential to liberalism? And I'm kind of butchering his answer and the way I asked the question. But the thing that he said to me that I found of particular interest was that you can get to a liberalism essentially without the Enlightenment, and that classical liberalism, and that American Revolution was less of an Enlightenment product than people suggest. And he said, and I said, well, what would I read to make that argument? He says, well, read the introduction to de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where he kind of starts with Aristotle. Yeah. And then doesn't really talk about a lot of the Enlightenment figures, and doesn't really talk about liberalism. And he uses democracy as kind of a term for republicanism or liberalism, but it's all the same. And so part of that's where I'm trying to get at is it's so much easier to talk about the development of political systems by looking at the political thinkers who wrote about them. Yeah. And I wrestle with this all the time, is how much do they deserve the credit for it? Or is it like the fact that the wars of religion were so terrible that people were just sort of like, this isn't working. We should probably have some toleration for people who disagree with us about this stuff. Remember what that thing that St. Augustine said about the city of God and city of man? Maybe he was right about some of that stuff. Yeah. And that the ideas are important because they help people get buy-in. But the fact is people want to buy in because the facts on the ground change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, and I'll tell you maybe the efficient cause of why we focus on the philosophy and theory and not on the historical practice, because you have to be Tocqueville or Montesquieu to focus on the historical practice. You have to know everything, right? It's really hard. It's a lot easier to read Locke and have an explanation that if you can understand the theory. But no, of course. But this is, I would say, even in Tocqueville, Tocqueville talks very little about Christ. Maybe only of Jesus. There's only maybe one passage, and I'm not sure about that, but there's one key passage in, I think it's in volume 2, where he talks about Jesus, and what does he say? It's something like this. He's making a reference to Aristotle and history of political thought, and he says something. I'm paraphrasing here. Something like it took someone like Jesus to come in and to teach Aristotle and everything. He says they were all part of the aristocracy of bastards. And it took someone as, in a way, simple, teaching as simple as the one offered in the Gospels, to teach humanity that all men are created equal. And look, you can have an understanding of equality that is not dependent on the Gospels. It's certainly not dependent on Jesus, the historical figure. But that idea is, you even with all the changed circumstances, you need the idea. Mm-hmm. So you might need the circumstances, but you need the ideas aren't unimportant. Maybe that's all I'm saying. And that I agree that even appears in Tocqueville. Yeah.
The simple fact is history happened the way it happened, right? And we may have imperfect view of it, and we may discover new facts and new evidence for this or that. But basically, if you know anything about the history of the last 2,000 years, the fact is that Christianity, in particular, Judeo-Christian tradition, if you want to call it that, is where our rights and liberties originated. Yeah. Not purely, not entirely, not without hypocrisies and setbacks and all that, but like just the mental structures required to think of human rights and human equality and all that. Yeah. They didn't spring up independently of that tradition. And it's perfectly fine to say they could have, but they didn't. Yep. And they pretty much didn't anywhere except in the West. And that really angers a lot of people who want to believe in equality and human rights and all of these things, but they don't want it to be a religious term. And
Yep.
I agree with you. It doesn't have to be. But if you're talking about where it comes from, you don't get to invent new history to say, oh, no, it came up this other path through the back stairs of nihilism or something, because it just didn't.
Yeah. I'll give you this is just an example to put some flesh on the bones of what you just said. I mean, the idea that this is to get back to the article I started our conversation as well. The idea that that true worship must be given freely.
Mm-hmm.
That is an idea that comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that true worship is worship of conscience, of conviction. Like, you don't get a philosophy of religious freedom or limited government without that idea.
Right.
Like, it's just not going to happen. And that it happened in the West, in the Judeo-Christian West, is not a coincidence.
So I'm curious about this. I mean, you've mentioned a bunch of times, so it's not like and you teach at Notre Dame, but you're Catholic. And the fullest expression of that, from my pseudo-intellectual demi-Jew perspective, of this idea of faith must be voluntary and sincere, is Protestant, right? I mean, it's the story of the Protestant Reformation is sort of throwing off the middlemen of the Catholic Church and having a direct relationship with the text or with God or whatever. What is your... Because I have my own... I'm a big defender of the Catholic Church in all sorts of contexts, but what is your... What is the Catholic answer to why no, you do need priests, you do need the institution, you do need these other layers of authority, but by the way, faith should be sincere, all the same. Like, how do you square those circles?
Yeah, I mean, this would take a lot more time, a lot more knowledge, and a lot more expertise than I have. So I also want to stay in my own lane. But look, part of what we know as a religious believer, as a Catholic, you can, roughly speaking, divide knowledge into that's subject to the natural law, which is available to human reasoning, to philosophy, and those truths that are accessible only through revelation. You know, the Trinity, for example. The belief among Catholics is that the Church is how we have sure knowledge of divine revelation, things that are above reason, that we can't reason to ourselves. That it's reasonable to have an institution that holds these sacred truths by divine right, to connect a theme we've talked about earlier, because they are above reason. It's not possible for us to have access to them directly. So there's got to be some way to know the truths above reason. The question, the real disagreement is how do we have knowledge of those truths, right? And it can be through an institution, or it can be directly through the individual. Problem is, what happens when individuals disagree? Who arbitrates?
The defense I always offer about the church is that there's, and again, it stems from my arguments with people on the left, because there's a whole tradition on the left against reason.
Yeah.
Right. And that sort of romantic sense of just going with your instincts and listening to yourself and all that kind of stuff. The Catholic Church is very good at explaining to young, hot-headed young people that you need reason to have a rightly formed conscience.
Yeah.
Like, psychopaths have consciences too. They have ids and interior lives. It doesn't make them right. And the sort of that scholastic tradition in Catholicism, maybe because it's so similar in some ways to the Jewish textual tradition, I'm very sympathetic with, and I find, like, Aquinas takes you along on an argument. I like arguments. And a lot of the Protestant stuff, there's less of that. And so it may just be my priors intellectually are the thing that make me more attracted to Catholicism. Although there are lots of people there keep trying to convert me to Catholicism. They should stop that. But that's a conversation for another day. Last question. Can I just bounce off of you?
Yeah,
And then
of
I
course.
promise to let you go. So I have this theory. I first got this idea. I want to give credit to Mike Duncan from the Revolutions podcast, who did just this, I think it was 100 or like 98 episodes on the French Revolution. And he had a couple times he had these offhand comments about the French Revolution that I then started pulling on the string for a long time. One of the reasons why I think the French Revolution goes off the rails, if we're talking about like facts on the ground versus big grand ideas, is that, first of all, a lot of the French revolutionaries in the various governments that go up and go down, after 1789, first of all, a lot of them are drunk, but that's neither here nor there. Except insofar as a lot of the revolutionaries' meetings were public, and the problem with having political revolutionary meetings in public is that you get a lot of day drinking drunks in the peanut gallery too, and they start cheering for the most irresponsible, demagogic people rather than the most restrained and reasonable people. And people start playing to the crowd like Leslie Nielsen in the Naked Gun movies when he's the ump. And so people start writing rhetorical checks that they can't cash, and everything goes nuts. Meanwhile, the single greatest, other than maybe the Council of Nicaea, the single greatest smoke-filled room in all of human history was the Constitutional Convention.
Exactly.
Where these guys behind closed doors, just like they should have had Elvis's logo of TCB with the flash written on the outside, right? Taking care of business in a flash. And like they got it done without taking a poll, without asking a crowd what to think, and then they delivered a finished product. And to me, that's a big part of the Republican part, right? Is that serious people who have the best interest of the Republic in mind, sometimes they have to have conversations out of public view. And I think that's one of the things that in the age of radical transparency, that's one of the things that is just sort of lost on the political conversation, because in a populist age, everyone thinks that they should have front row seats to everything.
Yeah, I mean, do we actually think cameras in the House of Representatives have improved Congress?
No.
Do we really think that cameras at the Supreme Court would lead to better lawyering? No, you get pandering, right? No, this is, look.
Imagine jury deliberations in celebrity cases that were televised.
No. I mean, this is common. Look, adults who are serious understand this.
Yeah.
It's not that hard, right? So sometimes, look, what you want is office holders to be responsible, so they can be held accountable. But they're responsible for their product at the end, what they actually deliver. And sometimes they can't reach reasonable compromise unless it's behind closed doors. Every sensible person knows this, right? But
to my point, there are a lot of sensible people that if you ask them this on a podcast or on TV, they'll say something different about the people's right to know and blah, 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 blah. And that's the problem.
We live in a democratic, and especially we live today in an open age. And here's one thing that ancients and modern political thinkers, modern philosophers all agree, right? That usually political wisdom lies in understanding the spirit of the age and counteracting its bad tendencies.
Mm-hmm.
So the spirit of our age is more democracy, more openness, more. Martin Diamond published his collection of essays was as far as Republican principles can admit.
Allow or admit,
allow. Meaning that the founders understood, because they're going to have a government of the people, we have to put as many aristocratic limits as possible.
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to have an aristocracy, you got to make it more democratic. If you're going to have a democracy, you got to make it more aristocratic. And that pervades almost all of our lives. And this is to go back to Tocqueville. I mean, this is his great understanding, right? That in an age of equality, the danger is not insufficient equality; it's too much equality. Right.
All right. I've kept you too long. We started too late, but I hope you'll come back, and thank you for doing this.
Absolutely delightful. Anytime you want.
All right, so Phil Muñoz, I have trouble with that name. It's the tilde thing on the end. Has left the studio. We spent another 20 minutes talking, so my entire morning has been blown up, but I had Straussian questions to ask him. And I think this will probably air next week, which is good because there's literally nothing going on in the news that would make that a problem. Could have gone a bunch of different ways. I should have stayed more on the article, which the essay that he wrote, which I really do recommend to people. And his point, people have heard me talk about Frank Meyer a million times here about fusionism, this whole idea that, virtue not freely chosen isn't virtuous, and that this is an inherent tension in Western civilization. But Phil's point on how the third revolution in the American Revolution being the fact that worship must be free to be authentic and sincere, that it must be there's sort of a lot of redundant adjectives I just used, but that it cannot be compelled, it cannot be coerced to be legitimate. That's very much a fusionist idea, right? And I should say fusionism is very much in line with that idea, since that idea is much older than fusionism is. But it's this idea that compelled virtue is not the proper function of the state. To encourage virtue, to make it easier to be virtuous, to lift up obstacles to the virtuous path, is something that the natural rights Republican tradition and big chunks of the liberal tradition and the American tradition, celebrates. But it's not. But actually, compelling virtue is illiberal and antithetical to just government, and I think that point is worth remembering. And it comes to mind when I was reading his essay. And there's another essay that people should read if they're really interested in this stuff, also by Irving Kristol, called "When Virtue Loses All Her Loveliness," which there were several times when Phil was talking particularly about libertarianism and how there is no end goal, right? There's no purpose to freedom. Freedom is a end unto itself in the libertarian mind, which I don't think is the worst idea in the world, but there's some criticisms one can draw. And in Irving Kristol's essay, "When Virtue Loses All Her Loveliness," he teases out that point really brilliantly and illustrates it. It's one of the few times somebody has criticized Friedrich Hayek where I've kind of sided with the critic. And maybe I'll talk more about that in the solo. Even though the solo is probably going to come out before this comes out. It's all so strange when you're traveling the slipstream of time. So regardless, thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.